Шановні учасники, ми розпочнемо буквально за хвилину, трошки дамо час всім
Dear guests, we are starting in a minute, just giving you a minute to join. Today, we will have a simultaneous translation from English into Ukrainian, so you can use this option by pressing the button at the bottom of your screen. You can see it there. And so choose interpretation, choose Ukrainian. So, dear guests, welcome to our 14th lecture presented to you by Roskut Urban Coalition for Ukraine. Today we're discussing heritage, a very important topic, an urgent topic for Ukraine, both today during the wartime and it will be urgent after the war. Today we are presenting to you the research of our colleagues, and you will have an opportunity to ask them questions. I would like to remind you that we are working with simultaneous translation. You can choose Ukrainian now, because the lecture today is done in English, and you can also use the chat and Q&A options for questions. Please ask your questions both in Ukrainian or in English. So I'm giving the floor to Linet Bradels. Linet, we cannot hear you. You are muted.
Sorry, I lost my whole screen. Welcome everybody. Thank you, Margot, and thank you all for being here. I'm very pleased to have our guest on this, I must say, quite special day, maybe for me personally, but also for Roskvit. And it's because there's today a kind of strange combination between Ukraine and the Netherlands. And I'm from the Netherlands. Today, and of course, Roskvit's co-founders is one Oleg Drozdov from Ukraine and Fulko Treffens from the Netherlands. So there's the combination. And today, President Zelensky visited the Netherlands. He was in The Hague for most of the day, visiting our Prime Minister, the Parliament. He visited the King and had several visits and several talks to people. And today is also the 4th of May, which in the Netherlands is the commemoration day of the victims of the Second World War. And every year in the Netherlands, we have a kind of discussion about who to commemorate, and is this with whom to do it also, and who's going to talk on it, and how do we organize this so many years after the war? And then we talk like things, is this only about all the Jews who have been deported and killed? Is it all the World War II victims, like also the Roma and the Sinti? Is it about the homosexuals and the soldiers, the citizens? Who are we actually commemorating? These discussions, they are important to have when they are performed well and really thought out and with care. But they also show that memory and heritage can be often very contested and open to several interpretations. So what a better night actually to have Loes Veldpaus and Dóra Mérai talking about this difficult and sometimes controversial question of what to preserve and what to let go when reconstructing after a war-torn area or in a war-torn area, and what to do after this war situation. What do you keep, what do you leave? So the speakers, the two of tonight, they are promoting a kind of integrated approach to heritage and a conversation that really focuses on the management of the built environment as inherited from the past and being developed towards the future. So I'll shortly introduce them and then quickly give the floor to them and not keep too much time. Dóra Mérai is art historian, archaeologist and cultural heritage expert. She is researcher and lecturer at the Central European University in Vienna-Budapest, and her specialism is in heritage policy and management, memory studies, industrial and urban heritage, adaptive heritage, and reuse. Loes Veldpaus is a lecturer of architecture and urban planning, which is also her background. She is working at the Newcastle University in the UK and one of the co-directors of the Centre for Heritage at the Newcastle University. She has, as I said, a background in architecture and urban planning, but also in heritage studies, and researches and teaches between and across those different disciplines and areas. She has a focus on what the process of remaking and reusing heritage, both material and conceptually, do in the context of urban governance. It's a mouthful, but that makes it, I think, me very curious of the coming 30 minutes. So the floor is yours, please. Dóra, I think, will be the one who starts. Dóra, your mic.
Now it works. Yeah. So thank you very much, Lilith, for the introduction and also for the invitation. And I cannot move the slides. It doesn't. Okay. Yes. So first, I would like to start with a little introduction of what we are going to talk about today. We would like to address first heritage and what heritage is in this war situation. Then to continue with a few definitions in terms of heritage in planning. So what is our understanding of heritage and planning? Then we would like to argue why to integrate heritage and planning, and how can heritage be put to work in planning. Then we will finish with heritage in post-conflict revitalization, which is the focus of Rosquit. And we would like to invite you with a few ideas for a discussion, what could be done in practical and conceptual terms. So let me start with heritage. Everyone's right to their heritage is a key element in international law on heritage in armed conflict. International policy documents previously focused on looting or collateral damage on cultural heritage, including the Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict, signed in 1954. And this is still the primary regulatory instrument on heritage in armed conflict. UNESCO in 2003, however, officially recognized that heritage can be deliberately targeted in armed conflict as an important component of the cultural identity of groups and individuals. And this intentional destruction may have adverse consequences on human dignity and human rights. This aspect is rightly emphasized by Ukraine, accusing Russia with deliberately attacking identities and memories by destroying material heritage. On the other side, Russia accuses Ukraine of depriving their ethnic minorities of practicing their human rights in terms of culture, and provides this as a reason for the military invasion. Culture and heritage are used and abused in this conflict and any conflict because they are symbolic of national identities, power relations, and they have the potential to produce and reproduce boundaries, also to mobilize masses in the service of multitude of political goals. But this is not the only way heritage in Ukraine has been used and reframed in the past few years. The cultural heritage of and cultural heritage in Ukraine does not mean the same anymore for Ukrainians as before the war. Much is lost. New heritage is emerging, and the meanings attributed to the same sites, objects, and practices have been radically transformed. Heritage is used in this conflict to produce divisions, but it is also used to develop empathy, express solidarity, and help people cope with the difficulties. Odessa's designation as UNESCO World Heritage was a way to express international solidarity. The UNESCO World Heritage Committee inscribed the historic center of Odessa on the World Heritage list in this year's January, and this is the 8th World Heritage Site of Ukraine. And this happened despite the opposition of Russia. Part of the site was immediately added to the list of World Heritage in danger. While the World Heritage listing aims to protect the material fabric of the historic city center, the process of listing itself is also meaningful, and it's recognized as being meaningful. UNESCO's Director General, Audrey Azoulay, referred to the ways in which the war impacts Odessa as an argument for the inclusion. This is what she said. There was first a symbolic aspect, which is that of saying this city belongs to the World Heritage. It concerns us all. We are all looking at it. We all see it, and we recognize its history and contribution to heritage.
Yeah, and I think this is actually quite important because it kind of shows how we make things matter by making it heritage. We would argue that nothing is intrinsically heritage, and that we always select what becomes heritage, and that depends on also who is selecting that heritage, and who does that means that different things and different ideas and different places get selected when there is different people doing the selecting, or different groups doing the selecting. So in the case of Odessa, UNESCO kind of decided what heritage is, of course, because it's following their definitions and rules, but it's based on the opinion of experts in the form of a national nomination as put forward by Ukraine. Recent heritage discourses recognize that besides this kind of like authorized and designated heritage, there is all kinds of other kinds of heritage that can be defined by people, that can be defined by memories, by practices, associations, and stories. And heritage can be designated, of course, but also there's lots of heritage that is not designated. So it's important to think about a much broader understanding of heritage, we think. And that's why we also introduced some other ways of looking at heritage. So one other way of looking at heritage is defining it as a process rather than just a thing. So saying that actually what is heritage is mobilizing the past in the present. So by that we mean that we select what we label as heritage. It says a lot of who we are, because we are doing the selecting, depending, of course, on who is this we, right? So we are doing the selecting, and we are doing that with a reason. And I think that's the other kind of thing that we want to talk about in this lecture in relation to what is heritage, is really thinking about how heritage gets used, and how it gets mobilized in the past means that it has some kind of, we are using it to symbolize something, or we are using to do something with it. But of course, this can be to commodify it, or to mobilize it for development, a catalyst, an urban growth, but also to create national identities, or as we saw, solidarity. And in the Ukraine, this discourse on what heritage is has been dominated by experts. There are many listed monuments, and there is regulation on what you can and cannot do with it. And before the war, citizens could work maybe with official institutions as volunteers to inspect monuments and to take part in public hearings. But their role was quite limited, and the relevance of heritage for the public was typically not addressed by authorities. And this we can see is changing, true, and with the war, when these processes are not necessarily officially framed as heritage, or as part of the heritage discourse, they are very much demonstrating a shift in the relationship between state experts, the public, and what is heritage.
To demonstrate this, we brought a few examples. So the Ministry of Culture and Information Policy in Ukraine launched a crowdsourcing project under the title Save Ukrainian Culture. And this project aims to record damaged objects of cultural heritage and cultural institutions. They have recorded more than 1,100 objects in the first year of war, so by February, and they invite citizens to contribute to this collection. This project demonstrates an approach to heritage that is novel in Ukraine. They do not only focus on protected or listed monuments, but they invite citizens to define what they consider to be their heritage by recording the damage, even if they do not use the term heritage. This is part of a trend of increased civic activity since 2014, which has been pointed out many times in different contexts. Generally, this trend is rooted in an increased sense of belonging in the face of threat, and past with its material and immaterial legacy is a key element in any sense of belonging. The relationship to the past in the present and its implications for the future concern everyone now, since we feel that it has consequences on our personal life. For example, the diversification discourse and its implications for keeping and rebuilding certain structures in our immediate environment, or the loss of buildings and spaces that were important for local identities, even if these were not officially recognized as heritage. So clearly we witness and we are part of a change in what heritage is in Ukraine in the face of the war. Another example for these processes, heritage experts on site document war experiences. They collect images, oral histories. So a new layer of heritage is emerging due to and through the war. Old heritage sites also gain new or renewed meanings, for example, by serving as bomb shelters for locals or impacted by tragic events. Forms of national identity become more pronounced since they are threatened. The large-scale movement of people creates new communities, but also breaks up old communities. The documenting initiatives address these experiences, and they are relevant for heritage in terms of creating new collections, and also for discussing new values and new meanings connected to heritage. So they bring heritage values in focus that are not perceived as intrinsic. For example, age or aesthetic value, usually we perceive these as part of the heritage. But the interest is now on how values are created and attributed to sites and intangible assets as well by various communities. So what we see is that the concept of heritage, what we understood under this term, it is also changing in the expert discourse now. And the example that I brought is the documenting experiences of war initiative of the Live Center for Urban History. It's a set of projects collecting testimonies, visuals, diaries, dreams, and archiving also the content of Telegram, which is the main communication, online communication channel now. They also organize workshops. They also organize workshops, exhibitions, and they create various other forums to discuss what heritage is and what is its role in and after the war. This type of discourse with an open and flexible approach has the potential to use heritage to work across boundaries within and outside Ukraine. Ukrainian heritage regulations emphasize the preservation of authenticity and perceive change as a threat to heritage. However, heritage is clearly changing in this war, both physically and conceptually, though it is always changing, since our values are constantly changing, even if it is not as visible and sudden, and in the case of this war.
Yeah, and I think this is why when we move a bit more to the heritage planning element of the lecture, where because I think this is, you know, the moment where we think about, okay, what does heritage in all these changing forms mean within the built environment and within the idea of rebuilding. And then part of our argument is that we need to integrate heritage more into planning. We need to think about how we can manage heritage through planning rather than as something very separate from the kind of like redevelopment, regeneration, revitalization of cities when that is happening. So heritage planning, we would define in a way as a process of identifying, protecting and managing places, objects and traditions that are deemed to have cultural, historical, architectural or other significance by a group or of people in society, but very much also managed by the planning system, let's say. So it's not just like heritage that we identify, but also thinking about what the planning system does in relation to this. So a lot of this is about balancing, in a way, preservation or protection with development and change, because that's, of course, kind of what the opposition, the initial opposition seems to be between what we do with heritage and what we do in planning. So it's really trying to make it more integrated by trying to make it less black and white, less 0-1. And an important question to ask, of course, is not just how do we integrate and why do we integrate, but also what does this do and what does this mean? So what kind of things does it make possible? But also what kind of things maybe does it make difficult or complicated? So in the lecture, we will talk, you know, we will talk about, or we are talking about heritage and what it does, and how heritage, the integration of heritage and planning can be helpful, but also always questioning a bit what we have to be careful with and why. So one of the questions, for example, we could ask is how heritage planning can contribute to spatial and social transitions, to identity and belonging, and to a more just and equitable future. And the history of kind of thinking about integrating heritage and planning, especially in a Western European context, has been mapped out, let's say, in a paper by Joks Jansen and some others. And they come up with this idea that initially, when we were thinking about heritage, we were thinking about heritage as a sector. So this refers to kind of like the ideas about heritage that came up in the 19th century, let's say. that it's really thinking about heritage that is under threat by spatial and economic dynamics and development, and we should preserve it and designate areas and places in order to prevent loss and protect them from this development. But already quite soon, there is this kind of move that maybe heritage could not just be a sector, but it's moving into spatial planning, thinking about heritage as a factor in spatial planning. So it's a negotiable aspect in market-driven spatial developments and public-private partnerships. And it's kind of part of planning and regeneration strategies. And then later on, they say that then there is this idea of heritage as a vector. So heritage becomes used in spatial planning projects, providing an endless supply of historical sources, context that can guide development. Very much kind of thinking about heritage in this much more open way. That is mobilizing the past in the present, and it can be many things, and it's not just one thing. There can be, as Lilith also said in the beginning, many stories that we, have to work with when we think about heritage. And of course, this is not something that it's happening one or the other. These three kind of paradigms, if you want to call them that way, are happening parallel to each other also, of course, all the time still. And then also in a recent publication, which I did together with Joks, who developed this, we were thinking about maybe we should see heritage as an actor. So heritage as something that actively does something, that is not just a means to an end, it's not just sitting there and we are deciding what we do with it. But when you see heritage, it also does something with you, and it also does something, makes you feel something. So what does that mean when we think about it that way? And I think if we think about those different ways, then we can start to understand maybe also why this push for integration, kind of how this kind of develops. So this push for the integration of heritage and planning has been happening since the 1990s, really moving with this heritage as a factor, kind of how they define it, and has really increased post-financial crisis, so post 2008. And I think this is interesting. It's of course very different from the Ukrainian context right now, but at the same time, there is some kind of crisis response happening after this that we can maybe learn something from. So it's really trying to focus on recovery, and integrating heritage and planning is supposed to make it easier to reuse heritage buildings, and it's supposed to make it easier to reuse sites. And that's really making this argument for integrating heritage management and urban planning policies more common. And this is happening from both sides. So it's happening both internationally, where, for example, UNESCO is pushing for this, coming with examples, wanting heritage to be a real player in the field of urban development and integrating it in the urban fabric as much as in urban planning and sustainable development policies. But also very much locally, because post-crash, there isn't like a lot of money and for new development, but actually those reuse projects can still happen. So that's one reason. And also there is, of course, need for new income into these cities and new kind of like inward investments. And heritage helps quite a few cities kind of like rebrand themselves, build up new industries like tourism, creative industries, and kind of really help by keeping the building industry going as well. But when we are doing this kind of, when we are integrating heritage in planning, we are in a way using heritage in the planning system, or at least that's what very often happens. So then instead of kind of being the victim of this process, it's really important to ask maybe, how can we put heritage to work in that process of reimagining and planning the future? So we take control, let's say, over that narrative. So then we can think about what heritage is and what and who heritage is for. So this is something, you know, that we discussed in the beginning. But also really think about what it does and to whom. And I think when we are identifying and protecting and managing places and objects and traditions, we really need to consider how these stories are selected and how they are defined and used. And because heritage is very easily used as a means to an end in spatial planning and kind of like put to work without, let's say, our say in it. When I say our, I mean people who mean well and want a beautiful city. So the state heritage as a means to an end is not new. The state valorization of heritage, for example, has been happening in an independent Ukraine, is intimately connected with the creation of the modern nation state. And from the 1990s, from the 1900s. So this was already a way of using heritage, of course. And over the past half century or century or so, heritage has been used for many, many more things. So it becomes mobilized for different ends, let's say, different means to different ends, which include political, cultural, economic gains everywhere. So this is nothing specific to the Ukraine or outside of the Ukraine. It's happening everywhere, as we can see. So this means that heritage is used for more things, which also means it's useful for more things to become thought of as heritage. And that kind of brings this broadening of the notion of heritage in terms of what can be formally designated and listed, but also increasing this acknowledgement of the idea that much more of what we could consider heritage is not formally designated. Thinking about the context of new heritage as being produced and, in the Ukraine, as Dora discussed before. So if you really understand heritage to be this means to an end, in many cases we need to understand the means and the end. So what heritage is for? Is it for identity or belonging? Is it for adding value? Is it any of those things or all of those things at the same time? And also what it does. So in addition to this, we can also think about what, not just what heritage does, but also we need to think about what heritage, the integration of heritage and planning does, let's say. That's the next slide. Sorry, Dora. And yeah, as I said, like after this 2008 financial crash, what we saw in some of our research is that a lot of countries actually used heritage very actively in their recovery policies and processes. So they were in favor of making the reuse of heritage buildings easier. These international perspectives come and also push for this. And heritage becomes really this catalyst in redevelopment and a contributor to place uniqueness, place branding, tourism, and kind of really asking for this inward investment. Yes.
So now switching to how heritage can be used specifically in post-conflict situations. Of course, heritage has been used in post-war rebuilding as well. If we look at places and areas that are rebuilding or that have been rebuilding after a violent conflict, we can also see how there is a pattern to how heritage is used, even if it happens different ways in different places, depending on more localized histories and situations. With Loes, we organized a course for the individual University of Ukraine last term, in fall term. And there we invited experts to discuss the role of built heritage within the redevelopment of cities and areas in post-conflict or still in conflict zones. So to discuss these situations with our students from Ukraine and experts from different areas, for example, Serbia, Syria, Ireland, Nigeria. So how heritage tends to be used in these processes. And what we saw that this happens in two primary ways. One that we called turning inwards, when heritage narratives are used to rebuild by building a very strong national identity. However, this leads to a very problematic, singular, ethno-national understanding of national identity. And this means excluding or erasing many other histories, for example, at local level, or of various religious communities or ethnic minorities and their heritage. We observed these stories in the former Yugoslavian, so the new states emerging after the collapse of former Yugoslavia, or also in various countries in sub-Saharan Africa and South Africa as well. And the other approach is turning outwards. So when rebuilding happens with international funding, there is a strong demonstration of the adoption of neoliberal Western capitalist values, or focusing on peace building, which often means ignoring local needs, ignoring other histories and layers, and also ignoring the ongoing nature of conflict and pain. So people whose heritage is in the focus, they still hurt and they are still very sensitive and will be for a long time. So in these cases, there seems to be no real intention for an understanding of what reconciliation means in that specific context. And to illustrate this approach, I would like to promote two great books, one by Vesna Kisic on former Yugoslavia and the role of heritage in the rebuilding after the Yugoslavian war. And the other book is by Sofia Labadi on sub-Saharan Africa and similar processes. So both of these approaches use heritage in planning and use heritage and planning. But it's important to note and to recognize these patterns. And these are, we can expect that these patterns will also reappear in Ukraine, since they appear all over, like globally. So to look at how heritage and planning is integrated or not in Ukraine, we are building on our research project. This is how I met Luz, and this research project happened still before the war, or started before the war. It's called Open Heritage, and it was on adaptive heritage reuse in various European countries. And here our partner, the Liv Center for Urban Studies, did the research on the heritage and planning governance in Ukraine. And what they found is that there is a lack of vertical and horizontal integration between heritage and planning in Ukraine. What does it mean? So district and regional administrations are responsible for heritage, but not each of them have specialized departments, and not every city has an office of heritage protection. So it depends on how many protected monuments they have. And even if they have, there is no vertical integration towards the regional and national level. They also observe the lack of horizontal integration. Heritage protection and planning run separately. Separate people are responsible for this, and the communication is not very advanced. So if a building is not protected, often the city has no influence on what happens to it. On the other hand, there is a category of historically inhabited places in planning. So heritage appears in planning in a certain form as well. In practice, if someone owns a protected building, the regulations and bureaucracy are awfully complicated to navigate and often contradictory. For example, there are safety regulations which have to be followed in order to use a building, reuse a building, but the heritage regulations prohibit the adjustments that are necessary. So ultimately, the reuse of certain buildings becomes impossible. And I also would like to refer to the recent decentralization trends of planning legislation. I think all of you know much more about this than I do. But the common conclusion about this decentralization of so the law on decentralization planning is that it favors developers, and this concerns the buildings and cityscapes which are not protected but represent heritage values for communities. So this can be a big problem. And why this is a problem? Loes, you are muted.
Loes.
Still muted.
Okay, sorry. Dora posed a very important question. Why is this a problem? Or at least why is this potentially a problem? And I think you can, from what she just said also, you can really see that like integration of heritage and planning is a conceptual integration maybe, but also very practically, right? It is very much about like, how do we make those departments collaborate, and how do we make those different governance levels closer to each other or collaborate? And also to say that we don't want to promote integration of heritage and planning just for the sake of it. I think it's important to really understand what it would do and why it could work, but also to understand what could go wrong. So why is it potentially a problem when it's not integrated, but also sometimes when it is. So whenever we are going to work on this, then heritage will be used. It's, in one way or another, or actually in a whole range of ways, whether that is to create and strengthen national identity, to recover economy, to promote, support greener development, or maybe to get funding from international donors. All of these ways are actually quite likely, and also at the same time that it will be used. So if we have separate heritage and planning systems, then that will become more complicated. And sometimes that's helpful, right? Because if you really just want to protect a building, then maybe it is not helpful when heritage and planning are much more integrated. But in many cases, it's also much less, not very helpful, as Dora very well explained before, when you have these complicated and contradictory situations where you want to do something and you cannot. So what is important is to understand these patterns and how we can go about it, and to really think about how will heritage be used, but also who decides how it will be used, and to think about how we can maybe bring that into the planning system to have a different way of going about that. And I think the next question is also the next slide. Yes. Is then also really thinking about what are the pitfalls of this integration potentially. So when we integrate heritage and planning, it's very common that you get to some extent at least deregulation, or at least better integration of regulation, but also deregulation. And heritage becomes positioned in a much broader context. So heritage is no longer just the thing that we have in the Heritage Act that we describe in terms of aesthetic value or in terms of historic value, but it becomes described in terms of, for example, character in character areas, or significance, or urban quality, or there's all these other words, and that are used in planning, but then become like ways to manage heritage that create this bit of a gray zone of what can happen, and there is a bit more space for negotiation in those zones, which can be very helpful for reuse, and it can be very helpful for rebuilding, but it of course can also invite corruption and commodification. What we also see as one of the main problems with integrating heritage into planning is that heritage then becomes part of the narrative of planning. So it becomes part of having to grow, having to have urban regeneration and development. So it has to somehow perform its cultural worth, but also its economic potential. And it cannot really be seen to block economic development. And that is in itself sometimes again, you know, a bad thing and sometimes a good thing, but also what it can lead to is that some of the stories that are not useful and that don't have economic potential get excluded. So again, these erasures and exclusions that Dora and me both, I think, talked about before. And of course, also integrating heritage and planning sounds nice and easy, but actually it's really a long and complicated process that goes beyond kind of like integrating the policies and the building regulations, right? Because it's really about reconsidering and changing also the roles and responsibilities of people in planning and heritage authorities. And of course, planning and heritage, both as policy fields or sectors, have cultural roots and ways of doing things that you may not easily change with changing a policy. So that all of that is to say, still we think that it could be very helpful, but there are also things that we need to think about and consider.
So finally, we switch to, like, our last two slides are what could be done. So a few ideas we would like to raise for discussion. So first of all, I don't know how many of those are here who are in the position to promote an integrated approach to heritage planning at national level, but I hope that we are convincing enough, we were convincing enough to point out that they should do it. However, there is a lot that can be done at local level too, with unofficial heritage and heritage communities. So a shift is needed from looking at only the national level towards the local level and building on the heritage work done now. So the work, heritage work I was talking about before, where people express what they see as heritage, as their heritage. And this way, heritage and planning can be integrated in practice via heritage thinking in planning. Then discussions are needed on what heritage is and what is its role in and after the war. This discourse, with an open and flexible approach, has the potential to use heritage to work across boundaries within or outside Ukraine. And these discussions, we argue, are needed among experts, but also with the broader public. And ultimately, in terms of planning, this can help to create a good space for living for everyone by incorporating everyone's stories and feelings about heritage. Then I would like to specifically point at the heritage of internally displaced people. Besides their practical needs, they should also feel at home and develop new place attachments. And mobile and intangible heritage can help in this. So the potential of this type of heritage can also be explored in urban planning. And ultimately, so finally, capacity building, which is done in planning and cultural infrastructure. And it's enough to mention Roskvit's new series with New Europe Bauhaus, but also the LEAD project or Creative Europe's new project. Roskvit also participates in that. But heritage efforts focus on war damage at the European level and rescuing heritage. For example, EU is setting up now a committee of experts. They are searching for experts who are experts in dealing with heritage in catastrophic situations, but not in heritage planning. So we argue that capacity building in terms of heritage is needed in this direction too. So not just focusing on damage on heritage.
So yeah, what can be done is, it has a practical side, let's say, what can be done really on the ground by talking to people, by working together. But also we were thinking about what can be done conceptually. So thinking about heritage slightly differently may help us kind of like do these things a little bit differently, right? So one of the proposals is to think of conservation as care. So to not think of conservation as protection, but think about caring for buildings and caring about buildings. And then we can also think about who is being cared for by caring for this heritage or by caring for this building or this material. So we start to think much broader about what we do in the built environment and include much more, of course, of heritage thinking in the broader built environment, not just in protected or listed buildings.
And then we also would like to just bring in the terms of difficult heritage, dark heritage, which these are terms that are used for conflict heritage, and this will appear quite frequently in the context of Ukraine as well. And still, it's not necessary that this type of difficult heritage becomes toxic heritage. So heritage is toxic if it is used to build boundaries, to create conflicts, and it's also, we can also think about heritage in terms of healing, its healing potential, and not being too idealistic about this, but there is such a potential. So if this shift from the national towards the local level happens, this can also help in healing at a local level, building on the heritage work done right now, even during the war. So thank you for your attention, and we are open for discussion, questions, comments.
Yes.
Я можу почати з того, що нагадую, що ми
I can start by saying that, dear audience, please go ahead and put your questions into the chat, or you can actually raise your hands and ask your questions live. I will start with my own question, if you please. In your opinion, when today we are talking about reconstruction, redevelopment of Ukraine, what would be the role of external expertise? Because you're not Ukrainian by nationality, but this topic is really relevant for you. So how would you define the role of external and national Ukrainian experts and proactive persons in working with post-war heritage?
Do you want to go, Dora? Do you want me to?
Yes, it's a difficult question, and I have been thinking about this a lot, because I truly believe, and I think it's based on the presentation, it's clear that those should have the voice, the major decision-making power, who are concerned by this, whose heritage we are talking about. On the other hand, also through our course on heritage and post-war redevelopment, we see that international experiences can really be an important source of knowledge. So maybe to raise certain points, to direct attention to issues which might be relevant, to be some kind of mirror to Ukrainian experts and the broader public. So this is how I see.
Yeah, I think it's a very, like there's very many aspects also to the question. So what we saw in the Invisible University, that some of the international funding and experts turned out to be quite problematic, but at the same time sometimes quite useful if you can tell one story one side and use it slightly different, so it can be useful on the other side. But yeah, as Dora said, like experiences from the Balkans, from Ireland, from Nigeria, from all over the world, that is societies or groups of people who have been thinking with this and and dealing with this over many years can of course be a very helpful and shared experience in some way as well. So it's there is no yes or no, you should or you shouldn't do this, of course, but some care, I think it's definitely important.
And I would like to just point one specific aspect. There is an ongoing discourse now in Central Eastern Europe among countries who are kind of who joined EU later, and they have an experience about also not in a conflict situation, or not necessarily in a conflict situation, but what happens when EU narratives come with EU funding, and all these structures arrive together. And so, for example, now in Belgrade in summer, there will be a conference. It's an outcome of a project called Shaking, which is about decolonizing knowledge, and it's north-south, but also east-west context. So I'm very curious about this, that it will be an exchange of experiences among people from this region. So I think this can be also useful context for Ukraine.
Thanks. Maybe Arina, is she on the screen? Do you have a question? Can you open your mic and maybe image? Or was this a mistake? Or can you put your question in the Q&A? And otherwise, Margot, you had another question, I thought. Margot?
Так, я тоді почну з питання від пані Тетяни.
Okay, then I will start with the question from Ms. Tatiana. Do you believe that, what is your opinion, whether Ukraine should first accept its historical heritage, historical memory, and only later talk about cultural heritage? Because the redevelopment, renovation of certain monuments could be really problematic for specific representatives of certain generations. What do you think?
I don't think that the two are distinct categories. So both of them are about how we make sense of the past now, and how we imagine the future. And if we think about monuments, so tangible cultural heritage, there are always so there is always the historical, what you call historical heritage. So the stories behind it that decide what to do. So what are the practical steps? And the other way around, that the environment we live in, it very much defines our historical consciousness as well, and our understanding of the future too. So even if it's not possible to renovate buildings because there is no money, no energy to start with that, a lot of things can be done with buildings besides renovation. So, talking about them, writing about them, taking photographs, organizing temporary events, discussions, visit this building. So I think these processes are somehow the same.
Connected, yeah. And I think the point is also that these processes are a constant negotiation. So I don't think there is a way you can do one thing first and then the other thing, like, because it's about how we define what is heritage and how we see the past. Then it's also always influenced by who is we. So who do we ask, but also new generations, people from different groups or different countries or from different places in the world. It doesn't really matter, but like there is always that negotiation, and of course to some extent the point is that what we have as heritage should also be the result of that negotiation and not the result of one person saying this is it and we can never change it again. So yeah, I think that's my answer.
So that's very close to Irina's question, I think, which was about funding. Heritage being most of the time require much more funding, which can be considered not a priority in a situation when needs are so pressing that you need to build hospitals, houses, and schools. So can you give practical examples where this integration of heritage into planning saves maybe money or even generates money? Well, that's that's a big one. Can you make money with heritage? You can with tourism.
I think, in fact, many cities are making money with heritage, but of course, this is a long-term endeavor, right? Because you can't make money with stones. You need to have people who come and pay for that somehow, or some other investment. But
yeah,
I think it's interesting to think about, like, so why is restoring heritage so expensive? To some extent, it is actually regulation, of course. It's because, and also because we have a very particular idea of how that restoration should happen. So if there is more flexibility and we have ways to kind of negotiate some of that, without saying it should be a terrible restoration or something, right? But like to think about, like, maybe we can have a negotiation because between like future uses, which in fact could be schools or hospitals, and what is important about those buildings, which are the stories and the histories we want to mobilize in those buildings. I think at the moment, because we have such a material understanding of heritage, like there is also this thing that the whole thing has to be preserved in a particular way, when maybe what is really deemed important about the building is the way it was used. And if we want to continue using it in the same way, but it needs some changes, then that might be a valid thing to do. So it's kind of thinking also about, like, okay, the integration of heritage and planning, for me, it just makes more of those things possible and more of those things negotiable. And I don't think, I don't know if I can give a concrete example of where this was beneficial, but I think, in many examples, in many ways, but I don't have the comparison to how it would be if it wasn't integrated. But I think it's more thinking about, like, where is the overlap and how can we negotiate those regulations and the uses and the future of those buildings without blocking all of that by saying this is heritage, because I don't think that's what heritage should be for. But maybe Dóra has more. You are mute.
When we talk about heritage buildings, usually we think about conservation or renovation, which is really expensive. But I can imagine that in this situation in Ukraine, not everything can be saved. And maybe there are buildings which are really important and valuable, maybe architecturally, maybe for their role in the community, but simply cannot be saved. And then, but it doesn't mean that they stop to be heritage. So there is also this possible approach to work with this, to keep on working with these buildings, even if they are not they cannot be kept in the material form. And this is good for the community. So there is the loss, but something else can also come, and this can be integrated into planning, like how the space and place of a building, of a heritage building, is still kept within a city and the community, even if the building has to go in material terms. So yeah, I think there are elements which actually do not cost money, but can make a big change in the future of the city and in how, like, ultimately this has financial consequences on the very, very long run.
Yeah, and I think there are even examples of where the stones or the material of that building are being reused in other buildings, which again gives other buildings a meaning, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this touches on the idea of the scars in cities that are left at some point. And I was just an open question if you have some ideas on what to do with those scars. I mean, should you erase them as much as possible, or keep some of them, or how do you deal with scars? Yeah, we ask difficult questions. We have a difficult topic.
But no, it is, and but in many ways, I almost want to say I don't think it's up to me to say how to deal with, because I think actually the most important thing is that people there, where the scars are, feel that it is dealt with in a proper way. Again, I think in these situations you can learn a lot from other post-war situations where they have done that, and where maybe the initial response was very different from 20 years later, when they felt maybe the initial response was too rushed to erase everything, for example, or to kind of start all fresh, or to keep everything. So it's looking to other examples to see what is possible, and think about what are the options, let's say, but also really looking at other examples in terms of how did they organize the process around this, and acknowledging that that is maybe a process of 20 or 50 years, and not of like, I know, you know, like there's a very practical element to it in terms of like, okay, next week we don't want that someone can be hurt in this site, but then at the same time, like the process of what it really means will be a very long one that only can be decided on the ground, I think.
And again, I don't think that this is like this black and white or 0-1 situation. I just remember that when I was a student and I had a fellowship in Krakow, I shared a room with an architect lady, and she was working on the Holocaust, so the place of a former concentration camp, a Holocaust site. And it was a scar, and instead of keeping it a scar like with a monument or something shocking, she was working on turning it into a park where people slow down, and so it's not a scar, but still a special place in the city. So I think there are also experiences globally in such terms. But that was also, so she worked closely with the local communities, Jewish and non-Jewish communities. So it was this conversation very much connected to the project.
Margot?
Так, я трошки
Right. I would like to add here, I don't know whether this is a comment or a question. We have quite a lot of clear-cut heritage objects, but there are certain heritage objects which are rather ambiguous. And so in Ukraine, we are participating in a discussion for a long time. What is heritage? So what is heritage in a city which is valuable, and what is heritage which is not valuable? And this definitely involves, of course, the change of values, the generation gap and things. So, but how can we deal with this process? Because I love your question today. Who are we? We who are deciding what is valuable, and what if the community doesn't believe that well, the heritage, tangible or intangible, is not accepting this piece of heritage, but for the professionals it is. How can we resolve this difference of interest between the community who doesn't recognize it as heritage and the professionals who see that that is heritage?
I like very much the question recently raised by heritage experts who work in the field of heritage futures. So explicitly, it's about the role of heritage in making futures. And So they pointed out that often when we experts think about heritage, it's about this is something that needs to be passed on to the future generations. And then the question is that will the future generations be happy with this what we pass on, or will it be like the China set inherited from grandma, which is it's wonderful, but also it occupies half of my tiny city apartment and I cannot use it in the microwave. So obviously this approach is not about simple solutions, yes or no solutions, but it again leads us to the direction that the only solution is not to protect and conserve and restore and keep it like that forever. But so I think this way of thinking about future generations and what we know, we don't know many things, but we know that there are big major trends which are quite clear concerning the future and the needs of future generations. So like, for example, to preserve an old building with thick walls, which is nice, cool inside because it was built before the era of air conditioning, that might be a nice gift to the future generations in the midst of climate change.
Yeah, I think it's also really interesting to think about those we's, right? Who decides and why do they decide that way, and why is something heritage? I think in the especially in the professional heritage sector, there is some kind of acceptance that some things are just heritage, just because that they have always been, and this is like, you know, castle, churches. Somehow there is this kind of understanding. But when we then, so one of those questions that we put in the last bit, like when we think about who do we care for by caring for this heritage, we can really start to think differently about what that heritage is. So if we preserve a castle, who is this for? And who are we putting towards future generations, or kind of like, you know, passing on? Are these the stories of elites, let's say, that are the only ones we want to pass on, or are there also other stories there? So if local communities do not necessarily value the same heritage as professionals, we can also think, you know, they are different we's, they are different people of who decide and select, and we can think about, okay, maybe they care for very different future, or they care for a very different past. And they want to mobilize different stories to kind of recognize who they are and what is important to them. And for me, what is interesting in that question is that somehow heritage in the professional discourse has been very fixed in the way it has been described and in what can be heritage. And yes, we are broadening that term and we are widening all of that, but at the same time, it's still very fixed, because it's still very much kind of like, thinking in a professional way, let's say, in a rational way, or in an argued way about what is important about history. When we ask communities, you get very different answers. I mean, first of all, you get answers because people have a particular understanding of heritage that you cannot really avoid, and they will think of churches and castles and all this. But also when you ask it in a different way, you will get very different answers, because they don't necessarily care that much about those formal heritage sites, right? Because it's not important in their lives. So then it's up to all of us, I think, to discuss like what is actually important, and is it important to carry on the tradition of nominating certain types of heritage, or is it important to rethink the concepts that we use? Is heritage actually still heritage, of course, also a very violent concept, right? I mean, there are so many cities where so much colonial history is rooted and anchored in buildings that is very painful for many other people, for many people that are also there. It's just not the people that apparently are worth caring for in the same way by protecting or conserving their heritage, let's say. So yeah, I think there is no answer there. in the same way, I guess, that it's a complicated question / comment, but yeah, it's a way to think about it that needs a lot of discussion.
I think one more sentence, that what Luz told, that it has to be asked differently to get the right answer about what is heritage for communities. And I think this is what is happening now. So this case study, when they ask about war damage, this is what is happening now, that the question is asked differently. They do not ask that what is your heritage, but they ask what are you sorry for? So what do you grieve? What do you feel your loss? And that's about heritage. And there are so many such crowdsourcing projects. It's just one that I showed, but there are several of them. So I think these are really valuable databases for planners to see that what people value and why, what is their heritage.
Yeah.
So we have one more question in the Q&A, and I think let's determine that as the last one. It's from Arina Janovic. Thank you for your lecture. In Ukraine, there are some groups of young people, mostly activists, who are trying to save the historical heritage of Ukraine. One good example is, and I'm going to pronounce this wrongly, Mapa Renivaci, but Olina will translate it rightly. I know they have troubles with the investors who are supported by politics or politicians, I guess. Do you maybe know how to change that and how to get the politicians on our side?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. But also the question is, do you want the politicians on your side? Because sometimes that can also be unhelpful in the long run. But I, like, everything is in the story, I think. When you can mobilize different histories and different stories, and when they are not useful to some people, they will not use them. And that's like, so you have to consider how far you're willing to go to fit what they would like to hear and what the story you want to tell, which is a very difficult negotiation, of course, and one that actually refers a little bit to one of the slides, thinking about, where the funding comes from, for example, and if it comes from international money, that sometimes it really requires you to tell a very particular story, otherwise they will not give you the money. Yeah, I guess it sounds a bit like this could be the case, and then it's really it becomes a very ethical question, right? Like, how far am I, how important is this material thing, and how important is the story, and how much are we willing to go another side to get maybe access to things we would otherwise not have access to? It's not an easy question. But I don't know the side at all, so I'm just talking in general terms. So I don't know, maybe when there are people also in the audience who know this side, they may have some ideas.
I would say politicians are, they want votes. So to get the politicians, you better get the people involved on your side, because if they are and they protest against a movement of investors, that might work at some points.
When we started to discuss in Rosquit capacity building and where should it focus, so where would it be the most impactful, then I don't know if you know this graph, the policy cycle, so where some laws or policies or funding schemes are created by politicians, and like how it is, by whom, why, and then it is accepted, then it is implemented, and then there is also a monitoring process always, even if they don't do it, for example, by voting, and then it goes back to impact how policies are made. And I find this very useful, this cycle, because to ask at every point that who does this, and whether this is the point when we can hack the system. So to make a little change that will change the entire cycle. So I think, and this is basically what Margot and the colleagues did in Ukraine. So they studied the system to understand where to start the capacity building, and they understood that to focus on local municipalities, this is the point now where to make a little change. So I think this approach, it might be useful or helpful.
Okay, maybe we leave it at this, unless somebody has a super urgent last question. Margot, you have something burning? Okay, then I would love to thank you for being here with us, for giving this insightful lecture. I think it was fantastic. We will put it on YouTube for people who want to see it again, or recommend it to other people to have a look at it. I am very happy you were there, and I learned a lot, at least, and it made me think a lot. So that is my first, and I think a lot of people do, because we hear a lot of applause from all sides. So thanks a lot, and I hope to see you again. Also, the audience, keep track of our lecture series on our website. You can click on the button to become get our newsletter, and therefore be informed about all the activities of Roskvit. And Margot, maybe you can point out the discussion on the 10th of May. I think that is our first public event.
Так, я би хотіла
Right.
всіх
I would like to invite everyone this week and next week to two events conducted by Roskvit. Tomorrow we have a presentation of grant and financial opportunities presented by the European Union, and it is at 12 tomorrow. And next Wednesday, on the 10th of May, our partners PBL will be in association with New Housing Policy and other organizations are going to present their report on new residential policy. This is an open event, and I will post the links in our chat. Please join our events. Ask questions. If you have any further questions, we are open. We will be happy to receive them by email, and we will happily answer and forward your questions to our lecturers, and we are always very appreciative of your thoughts, comments, and ideas.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much, Olena, for the translation.
Yes.
Thank you.
As always, fantastic. Bye-bye.